Paul McCartney rang and he said, no, I'm sending a car and a driver to pick you up. You're coming to my house because if they want to arrest you, they'll have to take me as well. It's a razor's edge between madness on one side and Satori on the other. Perhaps I can claim to be the first person to have ever used glitter on my face.
Let's start a podcast about our mental health for no good reason why. Let's call it Mind Cake.
Hello everybody and welcome to Mind Cake. It's the podcast where normally two wallopers wade through the weird and wonderful world of well-being. Today, I'm afraid, it's just the one walloper, me. I'm Lee. Paul is off doing actual actor stuff. So, selfish, I know, but the man's got to put bread on the table. If you are a regular, welcome back. Did you not find anything else better to do? If you're new here, welcome. This isn't a therapy podcast. Nobody's handing out advice. We're not experts. It's just honest conversations with people who've actually lived through something, and we learn, hopefully, what it's genuinely taught them. So no jargon, no pretending everything's fine. A couple of listener messages before we get into it. Colin got in touch after the Men Matter Scotland episode, that was a couple of weeks ago, and said, it boosts my battery score just knowing this stuff is going on all over the country. That's the kind of whole point of this show. So, Colin, thank you to you. Today's guest, genuinely the strangest departure from the show I think we've ever had. His name is Prince Stash. This isn't your usual Mindcake guest, but stick with us, because underneath the Beatles stories and getting arrested alongside the Rolling Stones, there's something properly worth hearing about fame, identity, and what actually holds up when everything around you is utter chaos. This is part 1 of 2. So today is the rock and roll stories. Part 2's next Tuesday, and that's where it turns into psychedelics, mental health, and why he thinks your phone is quietly ruining your brain. Before we get into it, we're a completely independent show, no funding, no big budget, can't even afford Paul. Just me and a laptop most weeks, occasionally Paul when his diary allows. If you're on Facebook and follow us, the single biggest favour you can do us, which costs you nothing, tap invite friends on our page or share this episode to your feed. Right, well, without further ado, let's check the oven and get ourselves another slice of Mind Cake. So, Prince Stash, welcome to Mind Cake.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, I'm very excited about this. The only problem I have got is that I'm not sure where to begin. Having looked you up online, you were a friend of the Rolling Stones and Pink Floyd, a flatmate of Paul McCartney. Am I right in saying you modelled for a Playboy magazine?
Playboy magazine? No, it was a spoof on Playboy photographed by a famous photographer, James Baez, and with the help of some luscious creatures. And we wanted to just make fun of the American would-be playboys of the whole Hefner ilk, because we found it so, amateurish, let's put it this way, this urban stance and the whole thing,
Am I right in saying that you were featured as Harry Styles' dad in a Gucci campaign? Is that right?
Yes. Well, there was a very elaborate sort of concept to the whole thing, and they spent a great deal of money on doing this thing, and so I expected, there was a storyboard and there was a whole storyline, and Harry Styles was was my son, as it were, I was the patriarch of this sort of glorified hippie commune type of thing. And that's within the context of a campaign called Mémoire d'une odeur that Gucci did. Very lavish. They did use some splendid shots that appeared on buildings all over the world. I mean, massive, massive blow-ups that, 20, 30 stories high of this one image. And then I think I was for maybe 2 or 3 seconds in this thing that took a week to shoot.
Oh, really?
This dance in the castle, upper courtyard of my castle.
Well, I was coming on to that. So we haven't even done the intros yet. You turned down a lead role in the TV series The Monkees and now live in a 1,300-year-old castle in Italy.
Yeah, and in a beach house in California.
In a beach house in California. Yeah. So that's just the intro. And I feel, having read quite a lot on you, that that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yes, very much. The outer layer of the onion.
Okay, well let's get into it. Before we get into you meeting the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, you played in a band with a close friend, Vince Taylor, who I believe was wildly charismatic, leather-clad icon, the inspiration for David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust, I believe.
Yes.
But obviously he had a very public psychological breakdown. And looking back at that now, I wonder how witnessing Vince's trajectory changed your views on the potential dangers of sort of rock stardom.
It was, Vince Taylor was a great artist and a great performer and a very imaginative guy. But like all artists, there is a fracture in the psyche that there could be a possibility that someone would lose balance, and it's a razor's edge between madness on one side and satori on the other. Let's put it this way. So Vince Taylor went into a kind of religious madness, where he no longer, but he was still extremely charismatic, and he did. People expected him to be this rock star and to perform. And indeed, it was very unfortunate when it happened, because we were performing for his brother-in-law, who was a big-time tycoon in the entertainment world, who wanted to invest heavily into the band to go, during the British invasion of America. We would in the next big thing as well. And we were a great stage band. Our act was really extraordinary and very visual and so on. And he had left behind the kind of black leather rocker type of, he had his initial image that made him a star was that he was a sort of Elvis / Gene Vincent.
Yeah.
Sexier Gene Vincent sort of version. A very good-looking Brit who was raised in America from childhood, and had been in California. So he had all the best of the American and the English combined. And at the time, there was P.J. Proby. I don't know if that name rings a bell. He was a marvelous singer and a great star in the 60s in England. And he had influence. He had a ponytail and so on. And so Vince was very influenced by the whole new scene in London, the sort of mid-60s pop scene, and had into his persona injected that with my influence, because I had this kind of extravagant, mod, neo-romantic persona with a dash of utter extravagance, with wearing a stripper in Paris had given me some glitter. And so perhaps I can claim to be the first person to have ever used glitter on my face. And
were you not known as the Peacock?
No, that's an appellation that the press bestowed.
Oh, is it? Right, okay.
Not at all. Nobody ever thought of such a name. But, it was that kind of thing. Yes, later on, Brian Jones and I were often described as dandies, whereas I always reprove people saying, no, dandies was the Beau Brummel type of thing, being so fastidiously elegant, but as to be practically invisible, so elegant that there's nothing that you can, whereas that you can actually identify. Whereas we were more like les incroyables, those were people in the late directory before Bonaparte takes over and becomes Napoleon, the empire, and so on. But that late period, in reaction to the French Revolution, to the terror and everything, in the aristocracy, led people to great sartorial extravagance. And that's, in a way, what, without wanting to do it, what the closest movement in fashion that you could relate it to much more than to the dandies, because we would go deliberately looking for transgender clothes, not to make a statement about transgenderism as it would be today, but to look for ways to diversify and make medieval tunics and things like that out of girls' dresses and things, and this you get that in Brian and wearing those types of clothes and Monterey Pop, and myself in our second court appearance wearing totally extravagant gear.
When you say your second court appearance, was that to do with the Brian Jones drug bust?
Yes, that was a farcical, completely trumped up charges that were brought about because the establishment, it was a deliberate campaign in England by the establishment to eliminate the Rolling Stones, who were perceived to be a danger to society. So they thought if they got Mick and Keith had been busted at Redlands and Keith's house in Sussex in farcical circumstances, and they were up on trial the day that, against all reasonable odds, they came to arrest us, thinking that, well, if they got Brian Jones, who was arguably one of the most popular figure and the founder of the Rolling Stones, they would decapitate the band, which left with just the rhythm section would dissolve, and if everybody went to jail, that would have been the end of it. Instead, it backfired, except in the case of Brian Jones, where we went 3 times to court. The first one was a completely farcical type of thing, especially the arrest of the day. The whole thing was completely surrealistic. But the second court appearance was a little more chilling because we witnessed these corrupt drug squad people, and we were so naive, and they under oath gave a totally erroneous and false account of what had taken place during the bust. So we were so appalled that in the end, it really pushed Brian into a paranoid sphere. He got very alienated. He started to take refuge in the wrong, taking the wrong sort of things. He was told by his legal team not to frequent the other Stones because there was an attempt. Be careful, basically, was the idea, not to get. They had a very tenuous case, so nobody wanted to be that they could consolidate it, as it were. But we ignored all those type of things. Mick, Keith, myself, Robert Fraser, all these, everybody was a mutual support society. And Brian slightly, he came to see me, but he didn't see the other people. And and then he was persuaded in October of that same 1967 year to plead guilty to charges he was absolutely not guilty of. Worst thing was that they dropped the charges against me, which meant that in actual fact, the case was falling down.
Yeah, they had
But out
nothing.
of some misplaced sense of God knows what he wanted to atone for vis-a-vis his parents or something, he then decided to plead guilty, which was really the first couple of nails into his coffin, because he would not live 2 years after that. He would
Really?
die, in 1969, less than 2 years later.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions. It must be very difficult when something like that's going on to mentally compartmentalize, I guess, who you are from the media. You're known as two different things. I just wonder how did you separate the two? I mean, I know, am I right in thinking that you went to stay with Paul McCartney after that?
Well, while this happened, the day we were arrested, which I said is just one of the most bizarre days that ever occurred, with the press being told, with the TV camera crew having been told to set up at the right angle to see us coming out of the building, eventually under arrest. All that had been coordinated by the police, having announced what they were going to do. And so the press kept calling, and we couldn't believe that such a thing was even in the offing. And that, in a sense, was made the whole thing ridiculous. Anyway, to make a very long story short, when after this media circus that occurred at Chelsea police station, we had Brian's rolls brought to the front, all the report on, at least, who knows, tens of reporters and photographers were around it, and the cops sort of called a black cab and put us in the black cab in the back of the station, and we rode to the Hilton Hotel, rode the elevator right up to the penthouse apartment where Alan Klein was staying, and in the presidential suite, and there we saw ourselves on TV as we stepped out of the elevator,
Right.
on the 6 o'clock news or whatever it was,
Yeah.
It was absurd. And so Alan Klein pulled big time rank on the Hilton management to force them to give us rooms. They wanted to throw us out as soon as they heard we were in the building. And Alan Klein, much to his eternal credit, was, threatened all kinds of sanctions against Hilton. And so they relented, gave us rooms there. And the next day, Paul McCartney rang up. And also that same evening, they tried to rearrest us, going to the West End to something in Brian's car. And then Paul McCartney rang, and I thought that he was ringing Brian. And he said, no, I'm calling you. I'm worried about you, and I'm sending a car and a driver to pick you up. You're coming to my house, because if they want to arrest you, they'll have to take me as well. And so the Beatles formed a real alliance. I was suddenly in an incredibly privileged situation of being a protégé of the band and being able to record with them and all that, because they wanted to do things for me. And Paul McCartney was extremely generous, having me there for quite a while. We had amazing adventures. It was extraordinary, and it wasn't a flat, it was his Cavendish Avenue house in St. John's Wood.
St. John's Wood, yeah. Not far from the cricket ground. I just wonder what that safety and friendship looked like behind closed doors when the world outside is chaos. That must have been...
Well, it was wonderful, because the Beatles were such zany and wonderful and greatly creative people, and we had a fabulous time. We just, riding around in John Lennon's psychedelic Rolls Royce's Phantom 5, was just amazing. And we had many, many extraordinary expeditions and adventures and so on that were, in fact, the inspiration to Magical Mystery Tour, to a lot of things that much watered down versions of what actually took on. What I mean to say is that whilst, the situation was very bleak in that I was suddenly cut off from my own family, unable to report for a very important film assignment in Hollywood, and left without means of, so everybody took care of me, and I'm most grateful to this day to how I was treated, by Jimi Hendrix, by everybody. It was amazing. I was everywhere received as an honored guest, and everybody rallied around me, and it was very heartwarming. So yes, but there I was, without a passport, without the possibility of leaving the country, but yet in this highly privileged situation.
Do you mind if we talk alchemy?
We can, but it's always difficult to talk alchemy without going into platitudes about a very profound subject, which, in fact, the rooms that I'm in right now are full of mytho-hermetic iconography in the frescoes. And so very fascinating because it's early 15th century, early 1400s, wow. 600-year-old, Yeah. And so the alchemical, what fascinated me at all times was the expression of those ideas into pictures, and how a pictorial language inspired by Egyptian hieroglyphics with the romantic notion brought about by the discovery of the Orapolo hieroglyphica on the island of Andros in the early part of the 15th century, in 1422. Yeah, it was brought 1419. It was brought to Florence in 1422. So that brought about a real extraordinary renaissance and gave birth to the emblem eventually into the following century. It became the whole emblem and tradition and so on.
Mm-hmm. You studied Eastern wisdom traditions and underwent tantric initiations in the Kathmandu Valley.
I did, but before that I was Lama Govinda's I studied Tibetology with Lama Govinda at the Kesar Devi Ashram in the Kumaon Himalayas, and how I got there in the most extraordinary way. And Lama Anagarika Govinda, as his author's name is, he had written some very important books, Foundations of Tibetan Mysticism, but the book that really inspired me to leave the rock and roll life behind and to go on a journey to the East was a book called The Way of the White Clouds. It was amazing how that was meant to be, how I wanted to be like Sir Richard Burton, who went to Mecca in Mufti. I wanted to do the same thing going to Tibet as a deaf-mute sadhu, and with a caravan of sadhus. And when I got to the rendezvous point, the man who was organizing the whole thing had just died. So it happened that I was in a Himalayan resort that was not too far from, well, it was a whole day's trip. But Lama Govinda lived on a ridge, not accessible to vehicles, that in a house given to him by W.Y. Evans Wens, who wrote all those books about and had translated all the fundamental Tibetan texts. So I ended up there, and then I went on to Nepal and to various places. Yes, and I was the acolyte of the Chini Lama, and lots of adventures there too.
I can imagine. And what do you think is the biggest lesson that Westerners miss? It's probably another complete podcast episode on its own. But is there any sort of the biggest lessons that you think that Westerners miss when it comes to finding peace and mastering the mind? Because we get like these, again, I was always going back to TikTok and what have you, we get these little sound bites, but the reality and, like you said, what you've experienced, I would imagine, is very, very different from the watered down version that we get in the West.
Well, Tantra, for a start, is there's something now which is there's a fundamental dichotomy between what it became when it was transformed into a money-making yoga by somebody I knew very well, who popularized a Hindu form of tantric yoga. But it had very little to do with the kind of with Vajrayana, as it were, and Vajrayana practitioners in America face terrible troubles because Tantra is not for the faint of heart, nor is it for the sensitive little souls. You know, it's a very on the face of Western relationships that are based on, you know, people think, oh, it's a better way to intimacy or things like that. It's got nothing to do with any of that. If it uses sex, it uses sex as a purely, almost, you could call it an abstract device to achieve certain things, nothing to do with strictly speaking, pleasure or intimacy. Mm-hmm. So the partners that are used are literally it's usage for a specific purpose. And Western devotees, especially female ones, were extremely put off if chosen by a Tibetan master to be their consort. But what they didn't realize that it wouldn't give them a special relationship into that master's eyes. It was just a convenience, and they would switch to somebody else. As you would at a party speak to one person and then speak to the next person. Mm-hmm. And if the person that you'd been speaking to originally took offense that you no longer paid attention to them because you were withdrawing your attention, this is just the kind of misunderstanding that occurred. And the entire Tibetan circumstance of life, what this thing came from, is also came from polyandry, you know, about polyandry, when a woman has many husbands for reasons of not dividing the land and so on. So you can imagine that only very young people are employed. So all this now in this 21st century with all its prissy neo-puritanical way is an absolute no to most people. They can't, they see it as some sort of demonic, predatory practice, and you can't speak about these matters very well to people because there's a complete confusion in level.
Well, pick the bones out of that. Where do we start? The Beatles' studio story, the mountain climb, nearly dying, absurdly dressed. Truly fascinating guy. Obviously lived the most extraordinary life. And if you enjoyed that, then I suggest you tune in next week. Part 2 drops next Tuesday, and it goes somewhere completely different. We're discussing Syd Barrett, psychedelics, and one of the sharpest things anyone's said on the show about phones and mental health. And you will not want to miss the greatest piece of advice that he's ever been given. It is a first on Mind Cake. I'm saying no more than that. You will not want to miss it. A few messages that have come in recently that I'd really like to share. Bobby, on the Men Matter Scotland episode, said Martin was engaging and knowledgeable advocate for seeking help, and that his idea of having more than one go-to pressure release activity really resonated. Bobby, yes, that one really stuck with me too. On the School Avoidance episode with Dr. Caroline Keenan, KingMod94 on Instagram said simply, finally, I'm so glad this is being discussed. And Malcolm on the same subject on Facebook said it's something he's been through with both his kids. And Malcolm, that's exactly why we do this. Before we go, I'll mention again, we're an independent podcast, and following us on whatever app you're listening to properly helps. If you want more of this between episodes, links to our WhatsApp group and newsletter are in the show notes. And remember, if you're on Facebook, invite a mate. Seriously, just one, that'll do. Double our listenership. That's how shows like this survive. To get in touch, the usual sliceofmindcake@gmail.com. And we haven't had any words from people from Blackpool, so I think we've got away with that. Until next time, thanks for listening. And in the words of Dr. Jan, don't be a dick.